Jake had seen it all in his 15 years as a long-haul trucker. Late nights, tight deadlines, and strange cargo. None of it fazed him anymore. But this job was different. When he arrived at the warehouse, the manager was unusually quiet, avoiding eye contact as they signed the paperwork. "You'll be transporting a sealed container to a facility across the country. No questions, no opening it," the manager said, sliding a thick envelope of cash across the table. "Follow the instructions exactly and you'll be paid triple. And don't stop unless it's absolutely necessary." Jake felt a pit in his stomach, but the money was too good to pass up. He agreed, loaded the large dark metal container onto his truck, and started the journey. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. The highways were empty and the hum of his engine kept him focused. But as night fell, things started to feel wrong. It started with faint thuds. At first, Jake thought it was just the road, maybe the container shifting as the truck hit a bump. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Thud, thud. It was as if something inside was moving. He pulled into a rest stop, the eerie silence of the night pressing in on him. He stepped out of the cab, walking toward the back of the truck. The container loomed large, locked tight with heavy chains and padlocks. Jake couldn't help but lean in closer, trying to hear if the noise would repeat. Suddenly, there it was again. Thud. This time it sounded more like scratching. His heart raced. He reached for his phone, intending to call the warehouse, but realized there was no signal. He brushed off the unease, telling himself he was imagining things. After all, it could be anything inside. Machinery, parts, something that might settle during the drive. Still, the thought gnawed at him as he climbed back into the truck and continued the journey. Several hours later, the truck began malfunctioning. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine made strange noises. Jake's GPS went haywire, showing him routes that didn't exist. He tried to pull over, but the steering felt heavy, almost resistant. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, the truck broke down in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no towns, just darkness. Jake cursed under his breath and stepped out, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. That's when he noticed the chains on the container were loose. Fear surged through him. How could that be? He had checked them at every stop. Suddenly, a deafening bang came from inside the container, followed by the sound of something dragging. Whatever was inside wasn't cargo. It was alive. Jake stumbled back, panic overtaking him. He had two choices: open the container or leave it be. Sweat dripped down his face as he grabbed a crowbar from the cab. His hands trembled as he pried open the locks, one by one. As the last lock fell to the ground, the doors slowly creaked open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't supplies. It was a person, or something resembling one. The figure was gaunt, with pale skin stretched over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were wide, vacant, yet somehow aware of Jake's presence. Chains bound its arms and legs, but the way it thrashed suggested a terrifying strength. And then, it spoke. A guttural, rasping voice that didn't belong to anything human. "You shouldn't have opened it!" Before Jake could react, the figure lunged, pulling against its chains with an unnatural force. Jake stumbled back, slamming the doors shut and scrambling to lock them. His heart pounded in his chest as the thuds and scraping continued from inside. He didn't know what the creature was or how it had ended up in that container. But one thing was clear. He wasn't supposed to find out. Jake got back into the truck, desperate to get away. But when he turned the key in the ignition, the truck wouldn't start. He was trapped, in the dead of night, with something unspeakable locked in the back of his rig. And in the distance, headlights appeared. Another vehicle, coming down the road. But as it got closer, Jake realized with horror that it wasn't coming to help. It was coming to make sure the cargo stayed sealed. The last thing he heard was the screeching of tires and the final crash of the container breaking free. Road Rage Revenge. It was supposed to be a routine delivery, one more overnight haul across state lines before Jack could call it a week. The highway was empty, save for the occasional car speeding by. Jack enjoyed these late-night drives. The darkness, the quiet, the long stretch of road. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. Somewhere near mile marker 108, a car swerved out of nowhere, cutting in front of Jack's rig. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding, narrowly avoiding a collision. His horn blared angrily, echoing down the deserted highway. The car in front, an old, beat-up sedan, sped off, its taillights disappearing into the night. Jack muttered under his breath and continued on, figuring the reckless driver was just another idiot on the road. But the sedan came back. This time it tailgated him, its headlights glaring into his mirrors. The driver swerved left and right, flashing their high beams aggressively. Jack kept calm, trying to ignore it. He'd seen plenty of road rage before and knew better than to engage. After several minutes of this, the car sped ahead, pulling alongside his truck. Jack glanced over, expecting to see an irate driver yelling or flipping him off. But what he saw chilled him. The driver wasn't yelling or screaming, just staring. A man with hollow eyes, his face devoid of any emotion. Jack looked back to the road, uneasy. He thought about calling it in, but what would he say? A guy is staring at me? He shook his head, trying to shake off the weird encounter. Then the messages started. The first came over his CB radio. Static filled the cabin for a moment, then a voice, calm, cold, cut through the noise. "You shouldn't have honked." Jack frowned. He hadn't told anyone about the incident. No one else was around. Maybe it was just a prank, someone messing with truckers on the highway. But the voice came again, this time more sinister. "I'm going to make sure you regret that." Jack's skin prickled. He reached for the radio, trying to respond, but the line went dead. Then his phone buzzed on the dashboard. He glanced at the screen, expecting to see a message from dispatch, but instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "You'll be sorry. You're not getting home tonight." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He tossed the phone aside, telling himself it was just a coincidence, some random troll with access to the CB frequencies. Still, he couldn't shake the growing dread creeping up his spine. The sedan appeared again, this time cutting in front of him and slamming on its brakes. Jack swerved, narrowly avoiding a crash, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than ever. He was done playing games. He honked long and hard, frustration boiling over. Bad idea. Moments later, his phone buzzed again. Another message. "You're dead, trucker." Now Jack was rattled. He glanced in his mirrors, but there was no sign of the sedan. His truck rumbled down the highway, alone once more, but his peace was shattered. His mind raced. Who was this guy? Was he serious? He had to be bluffing, right? Hours passed with no sign of the sedan. Jack finally let himself relax, convincing himself it was over. Just as he was settling in, his headlights illuminated a chilling sight ahead. An overturned truck blocking the road. He hit the brakes hard, tires screeching. The highway was empty, no other vehicles in sight. But something about the scene was off. As Jack slowed to a stop, he realized with horror it was a trap. The sedan pulled up behind him, blocking his exit. Before he could react, his phone buzzed once more. "Get out. Let's finish this." Jack's pulse raced as he scanned the area. There were no houses, no signs of help. Just the dark, empty highway stretching endlessly in both directions. He grabbed his phone, dialing 911, but the line didn't connect. No service. He was on his own. The headlights of the sedan suddenly cut off, plunging the road into darkness. Jack sat frozen in his seat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind raced, thinking of a way out. He couldn't back up, couldn't go forward. His only option was to stay inside the truck, lock the doors, and wait. But then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a light tap on the driver's side door. Jack's stomach dropped. He turned slowly, eyes wide, only to see the man standing there, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the truck's interior lights. That same hollow stare, as if he was looking straight through Jack. The man spoke, his voice muffled through the glass. "Get out of the truck." Jack shook his head, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly. The man didn't like that. He pounded on the window, harder this time, shouting the same words. "Get out!" Panic surged through Jack. He fumbled for his keys, trying to start the truck again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized he was truly trapped. The man moved out of sight. Jack heard footsteps moving around the truck, then silence. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. Suddenly, the passenger side window shattered. Jack flinched as glass rained down, and the man reached inside, trying to unlock the door. Jack fought back, slamming the door shut with all his strength, but the man was relentless. In a moment of desperation, Jack grabbed his phone, intending to make one last call for help. But as he unlocked the screen, his heart sank. A final message had appeared. It was supposed to be a simple ride. Mark had been a truck driver for over a decade, and mentoring new recruits was part of the job. When the company assigned him a trainee named Eric for a cross-country haul, he didn't think much of it. He'd had trainees before, some nervous, others cocky, but they all got through it with his guidance. Eric, however, was different. From the moment he climbed into the truck, something felt off. Eric was polite enough at first, but quiet. Too quiet. He barely said a word for the first few hours, only offering curt answers when Mark asked about his experience on the road. Mark figured the kid was just nervous and decided to give him some space. They were in for a long drive, and he knew some trainees just needed time to loosen up. But as the miles ticked by, Eric's behavior grew stranger. It started with the glances. Eric would stare out the window for long stretches, his eyes unfocused, almost like he was seeing something that wasn't there. Then came the murmurs. At first, Mark thought he was just talking to himself, running through checklists or routes, as some drivers did. But one night, while Mark was dozing in the sleeper cab, he woke up to Eric whispering under his breath, repeating something over and over. "It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault." Mark brushed it off, thinking Eric was having a nightmare. But when he mentioned it the next morning, Eric just gave him a blank look and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The silence between them grew heavier. Every attempt Mark made at conversation fell flat. Eric either ignored him or responded with vague, cryptic comments that didn't make sense. One night, as they were driving through a stretch of empty desert highway, Eric suddenly turned to Mark and asked, "Do you believe in accidents?" Mark frowned, glancing over at him. "What do you mean?" Eric kept his eyes on the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You know, accidents that happen, but aren't really accidents. Things you couldn't stop even if you tried." Mark's unease grew. "What kind of accident are you talking about?" Eric didn't answer at first. His knuckles were white, his face tense. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I was driving a few months ago. It was late, dark, just like this. There was a family. They didn't see me. I didn't see them until it was too late." Mark's stomach dropped. He had heard stories like this before. Drivers haunted by the accidents they couldn't prevent. It was every trucker's worst nightmare. But something about Eric's tone, the way he spoke, sent chills down Mark's spine. I tried to stop, I really did, but the brakes wouldn't respond. Eric's voice cracked. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done. But I see them. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces." Mark swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He wanted to comfort the kid, but something about the way Eric told the story made him uneasy. As the miles passed, the tension in the cab became unbearable. That night, when they pulled into a truck stop to rest, Mark decided to get some air. He stepped out of the truck, breathing in the cool night breeze. Inside, Eric was sitting in the driver's seat, staring blankly ahead. Mark made his way inside the truck stop to grab a coffee, and when he returned, he froze. Eric wasn't in the truck. His door was open, and there were muddy footprints leading away into the nearby woods. Mark called out for him, but the night was silent. Panic surged through him. What the hell was going on? He followed the footprints into the woods, heart pounding. After a few minutes, he found Eric standing in a small clearing, staring at something on the ground. When Mark got closer, he saw what had captivated Eric's attention. It was a wrecked car, rusted, overgrown with weeds, clearly abandoned for years. The windshield was shattered, the seats covered in dirt and leaves, but Eric was standing there, frozen, his eyes wide with terror. "This is where it happened," Eric whispered, his voice shaking. "This is where they died." Mark's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, Eric? That car's been here for years." Eric turned to face him, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "I never left. I didn't survive the crash. I've been driving ever since. But I don't know where I'm going." Mark stumbled back, fear clawing at him. Was Eric losing his mind? Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. Mark turned, but there was no vehicle in sight. When he looked back at Eric, the young man was gone, vanished into the night without a trace. Mark raced back to the truck, his heart pounding. The passenger seat was empty, and his radio crackled to life with static. For a moment, he thought he heard Eric's voice, soft, distant, repeating the same words over and over. "It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault." Mark never saw Eric again. When he called the company to report the incident, they told him something that chilled him to the bone. There was no trainee named Eric assigned to him.